In a world where billions change hands behind closed doors, one woman's presence shattered the polished illusion of fairness. Her calm was met with cold suspicion, her rightful authority dismissed before it could even speak. Eyes narrowed, whispers rose, and a silent battle began, one that would unravel hidden prejudices and ignite a storm no one saw coming. This is not just about money moving through accounts. It's about a fight for respect, dignity, and truth in the face of relentless bias. If this story draws you in, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts below. Tell me where you're watching from and what you think lies beneath the surface. Nadine Prescott walked into Southern Heights Bank with the composed precision of someone who had fought for every inch of respect she commanded in her career. Her suit was perfectly tailored, her briefcase polished, her mindset on completing the day's critical business, the authorized transfer of $2.7 billion in corporate funds. She approached the counter with measured confidence and handed the letter across to Mirella Kane, the teller on duty. Mirella took it, glanced at the heading, and paused. A smile that was anything but friendly played across her lips. She cleared her throat in exaggerated fashion before reading it out, voice loud and incredulous so the entire lobby could hear. $2.7 billion? Seriously? Heads turned at once, drawn by the sheer volume and the mocking tone. Nadine's cheeks burned, but she forced herself to maintain her steady, professional tone. It's a legitimate transaction. The letter is notarized, signed by the CEO, and all documentation is in order. Mirella didn't even look up at her. She shook her head slowly, as though explaining something obvious to a child. "Oh, honey," she drawled with toxic sweetness. "You don't really expect me to believe you have this kind of authority, do you?" She laid the letter down like it was garbage and smirked, watching Nadine struggle to keep her composure. Customers in line shifted to get a better view. Some began to whisper, their eyes bright with curiosity at the unfolding drama. Mirella, feeding off the attention, decided to escalate it. She waved the letter in the air, letting the corporate seal and signature flutter for all to see. "Everybody look at this. She says she wants to take out $2.7 billion today." Her voice rang off the cold tile and marble, turning the quiet bank lobby into a stage for Nadine's humiliation. A ripple of laughter moved through the line. Nadine clenched her jaw so hard it hurt. She inhaled, ready to speak, but Mirella beat her to it with a pitying look. "Do you think you can just walk in here with a piece of paper and fool us? It's not amateur hour at this bank." The words hit like slaps. Nadine glanced at the other customers. Some stared openly, some smirked. Some wore uncomfortable expressions but said nothing. No one spoke up for her. She felt the heavy awareness that she was utterly alone. She adjusted her posture, kept her chin high. "I am authorized. That letter is legally binding. Please process the transfer as per protocol." Mirella snorted derisively. "You want me to just push a button and hand over billions because you asked nicely?" She leaned forward, lowering her voice to a mocking, conspiratorial whisper. "Between you and me, you should have picked a more believable number if you wanted to run this scam." Nadine's heart thudded, so hard she felt it in her temples. Her fingers itched to grab the letter back, but she forced them to remain still. Instead, she repeated, voice shaking despite her best efforts, "Call your manager. Follow your own policy." Mirella's smile sharpened like a blade. "Oh, don't worry. I plan to." She picked up the phone, dialing extension after extension until her voice rose deliberately. "Callum, you better get down here. We've got someone trying to move billions with what looks like a forged note." "Yeah, you heard me." Nadine's pulse spiked at the word forged, but she said nothing. She felt the weight of the watching crowd, felt their judgment peel back her carefully maintained composure layer by layer. Mirella let the phone dangle as she turned back to Nadine, giving her a once-over so brazen it was insulting. "You should see yourself," she said softly, just loud enough for the nearest customers to hear. "Standing here in your little suit like you're actually important. It's cute." Nadine swallowed, her mouth dry as dust. She gripped the edge of the counter so hard her knuckles turned white. The lobby had gone quiet, save for the distant hum of the security cameras. Every breath felt like a battle to maintain control. Then the manager, Callum Stokes, emerged from the back office in a dark blue suit, his mouth already turning down at the corners. Mirella greeted him like a conspirator. She handed him the letter with exaggerated care. Nadine Prescott barely had a moment to collect herself before Callum Stokes, the branch manager, took center stage with all the authority the position afforded him. His footsteps echoed sharply on the marble floor as he approached the counter, where Mirella Kane still wore that triumphant smirk. Nadine rose from her chair, wary and bracing herself for what was coming next. Callum's eyes flicked over the letter in Mirella's hand with a mix of disbelief and thinly veiled disgust, but he never once looked Nadine in the eye. Instead, he pointed toward a narrow hallway beside the teller counters and said with clipped coldness, "Step over there, please. You're blocking real customers." His tone brooked no argument, and with every inch she moved away from the counter, Nadine felt the invisible weight of judgment settle heavier on her shoulders. The whispers and sideways glances multiplied like wildfire. Strangers' eyes burned into her back like needles. Nadine reached the hallway and leaned against the cool, unforgiving wall, clutching her documents tightly to her chest, as though they were the last pieces of her dignity left intact. She was well aware of what was coming next, the real assault on her credibility. Callum lifted his cell phone, the screen illuminating his face briefly as he dialed numbers with an urgency that brooked no delay. "Corporate fraud detection," he barked into the receiver once connected, his voice rising enough for Nadine to hear the disdain that dripped from every word. "Yes, this is Callum Stokes at Southern Heights. We have a situation, a $2.7 billion transfer request that's highly suspicious." He glanced back toward Nadine with a hard, accusing stare and added, "We're freezing the account immediately. We can't have scammers draining that kind of money with a forged letter." Nadine's breath hitched, the cold realization that the bank was treating her as a criminal now sinking in fully. No one had even bothered to verify the letter or her identity. They had jumped straight to accusations and drastic action, shutting down the very account she represented. She looked back toward the counter where Mirella exchanged a brief, triumphant smile with one of the other tellers, who nodded approvingly. It was a silent victory dance, one that reinforced the message Nadine was unworthy of respect or belief. Despite her years of success, her proven track record, and the weight of a legitimate corporate backing behind her, she had become a target of suspicion based on nothing but appearances and assumptions. Customers in line whispered among themselves, their expressions ranging from amused to disdainful. A middle-aged woman shook her head and muttered, "Typical. Thinks she can just walk in and take whatever she wants." The words echoed in Nadine's mind like a cruel mantra. She felt her eyes sting, but blinked back tears fiercely. There was no room for weakness here, not in front of these strangers who had already condemned her. She turned her attention back to Callum, who was ending his call with a curt "thank you" before pocketing the phone. His expression darkened as he folded his arms, clearly pleased with the course of action he'd set in motion. "This kind of thing doesn't happen by accident," he said coldly. "We have to protect the bank and our clients from people trying to pull fast ones." Nadine's voice was steady, but quieter than usual. "I assure you, this is no mistake. The letter is fully authorized. I represent the company, and this transaction is part of our normal operations." Callum laughed, a harsh, humorless sound that felt like a punch in the gut. "Look, sweetheart, I don't care what you assure me of. I'm the manager here, and my job is to stop fraud. You're making a scene and wasting my time. I suggest you leave before security gets involved." Nadine's heart hammered against her ribs. She opened her mouth to protest, but Callum was already moving away, leaving her standing alone, vulnerable. Mirella came up beside her, lowering her voice to a venomous whisper. "You really should have thought twice before trying this. People like us don't hand over billions to people like you." The sting of those words was sharper than any slap. Nadine felt the walls of the bank close in around her, the air thick with hostility and scorn. She was isolated in a place meant for business and trust, transformed into a spectacle of disbelief and mockery. Then the heavy footsteps of security guards echoed from the back offices as two tall men in dark uniforms appeared at the entrance to the hallway. Mirella's smirk widened. "I called them," she said proudly, as if announcing a victory. "Just make sure you don't cause any trouble." Nadine's fists clenched at her sides, but she remained silent, knowing resistance would only fuel their narrative. The guards flanked her silently, their presence more intimidation than protection. As they escorted her back toward the main lobby, Nadine felt every head turn, every whisper sharpen into judgmental stares. Her stomach twisted with humiliation. The humiliation compounded when one of the guards muttered under his breath loud enough for her to hear, probably trying to pull a fast one. The phrase echoed like a verdict in the hushed crowd. Back at the counter, Mirella leaned toward Callum, whispering with smug satisfaction, "This'll teach her. No one tries to walk in here and take billions without consequences." Callum nodded. "Good. We can't let people like that ruin the bank's reputation." Nadine was led to a small, sterile room off the side of the bank, a windowless space with a hard plastic chair and a small table. The door shut behind her with a heavy click. She was alone, confined, powerless. Nadine Prescott sat stiffly in the hard plastic chair of the cramped waiting room, the sterile white walls closing in on her like the weight of the entire bank's judgment. She was acutely aware of every breath she took, every shuffle of footsteps outside the door, and most painfully, the rising tide of whispers and stares that still followed her. Through the narrow glass panel in the door, she could see Mirella Kane reappear in the main lobby, her posture commanding as she waved over two large security guards. They approached with slow, purposeful steps, their presence immediately felt by every person nearby. Mirella's voice was sharp and loud enough for those waiting in line to hear clearly. "This woman is causing a disturbance. We're going to have to escort her out if she doesn't calm down." Nadine's stomach twisted painfully. She was not causing a disturbance. She was trying to conduct legitimate business. But the narrative had been twisted so thoroughly, the truth had become irrelevant. One of the guards, a tall man with a square jaw and a hand that hovered near his holster, exchanged a brief glance with Mirella, who nodded as if to say, "Handle this." The man stepped forward with a cold efficiency that froze Nadine in place. Customers nearby whipped out their phones, some aiming cameras directly at the waiting room door. Whispered conversations flared up. Someone said, "Is she a criminal or something?" Another added, "Why else would security be involved?" Nadine's throat tightened, and a tear she had been holding back slipped silently down her cheek. She had never felt so exposed, so vulnerable in a place where she had every right to be respected. Through the glass, Mirella's mocking voice cut through the tension again. "Go ahead and call whoever you want. Corporate, the police, FBI, doesn't matter. You're not stealing billions from us today." The statement was not just a denial of Nadine's claim. It was a public declaration of her guilt in the eyes of everyone present. As the security guards flanked the door to the waiting room, Nadine realized that this humiliation was no longer confined to the bank's walls. The footage captured by the onlookers' phones was already spreading on social media, misrepresenting her as a fraudster, a criminal attempting to pull off an audacious scam. The viral video played snippets of Mirella's condescending remarks and the arrival of security, painting a narrative of guilt before any facts could be heard. Nadine's phone buzzed quietly in her purse, but she was powerless to use it. She felt completely cut off from her support, from her company, and from the truth. The guards stood guard like sentinels, their presence a constant reminder that she was no longer a customer but a suspect. When one of them leaned closer and said under his breath, "You'd better hope this all clears up fast," Nadine swallowed the lump rising in her throat. Time slowed to a crawl. The air around her seemed charged with tension as the people waiting outside the door whispered, glanced, and judged. Nadine's mind raced through every humiliation she had endured. Mirella's public mocking of the $2.7 billion amount, Callum's dismissal, the freezing of the corporate account, and now this degrading spectacle of being held under watch by security. Her spirit felt battered, yet deep within her a quiet flame of resilience still flickered. She understood that the stakes were higher than personal pride. The $2.7 billion represented her company's future, the livelihoods of thousands, and her hard-fought legacy. But at this moment, the cruel spectacle of being treated like a criminal, paraded before strangers and recorded for the world's judgment, threatened to crush her completely. The minutes dragged by with excruciating slowness until the door finally opened again. Mirella entered the room with that same triumphant smirk and threw Nadine's authorization documents back onto the table with a theatrical flourish. "We're done here. You're not authorized to make this transfer. The account is frozen." The words landed with brutal finality. Nadine stood slowly, gathering her scattered papers. Her knees trembled slightly, but she forced herself to stand tall despite the crushing weight of shame and helplessness. Mirella watched her like a predator sizing up her prey. "Next time, maybe don't try to play the part of a billionaire." The harsh click of the locking door behind Nadine Prescott sealed the last vestiges of freedom she'd clung to since entering Southern Heights Bank that morning. The small, windowless waiting room was cold and unwelcoming, its fluorescent lighting harsh and unforgiving, bouncing off the sterile white walls and making the cramped space feel even more suffocating. Nadine sat on the hard plastic chair, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her gaze fixed on the scuffed linoleum floor. The security guard stationed just outside the door stood like silent sentinels, arms crossed, eyes sharp and unyielding. Neither one offered a word or a look that hinted at compassion or understanding. Instead, their presence served as a constant reminder of Nadine's forced isolation, a physical barrier between her and the outside world, between her and the very bank she had trusted to process her legitimate $2.7 billion transfer. As she sat in the silence, the muffled hum of voices floated from the lobby beyond the locked door, punctuated by sharp bursts of laughter that sent a fresh wave of humiliation coursing through her. Nadine's ears pricked as she recognized Mirella Kane's voice carrying clearly, despite the distance and walls meant to shield her. "Can you believe this?" Mirella chuckled loudly on the phone, her tone dripping with scorn. "She actually thinks she's withdrawing billions. What is she, some kind of amateur? Bet she forged that letter at Kinko's or something." The words stung like acid on raw skin. Nadine's hands clenched into fists, nails digging into her palms. Even in the face of such cruelty, she refused to respond. What could she say? Who would listen? The insult was not just personal. It was a strategic weapon designed to discredit her beyond repair. Minutes stretched into a torturous eternity. Nadine reached for her purse, yearning for her phone, her connection to reality and support. The guards caught the movement immediately, their gazes snapping toward her like hawks spotting prey. "No phones," one said firmly, voice low but unwavering. "You'll have to wait for the manager." The weight of powerlessness settled heavy on Nadine's chest. She swallowed the lump rising in her throat and forced herself to breathe slowly. This wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a systematic effort to control and contain her, to keep her isolated while the bank's version of the story took hold unchecked. Outside the room, the muffled sounds of footsteps approached. The door swung open and Callum Stokes stepped in, his face the picture of practiced authority. His eyes scanned Nadine coldly, devoid of empathy. "This is for your own safety," he said brusquely. "We have to verify this little story of yours before you're allowed back out." Nadine's jaw tightened, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing her falter. "I've already provided everything you need," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "The letter is genuine. The funds are accounted for. There's no story to verify." Callum's lips curled into a thin, bitter smile. "That's not for you to decide. Until we get confirmation from corporate, you're staying put." He turned on his heel and left, the door clicking shut behind him, sealing Nadine's fate once more. Alone again, Nadine sank back into the chair, the walls closing in tighter. Her mind raced through the humiliation she'd endured, the public mocking of her authority, the freezing of the corporate account, the invasion of privacy, and now this cruel imprisonment. She thought of her company, the thousands of employees counting on this transfer, the deals that would stall and the livelihoods at risk. All of it seemed to crumble under the weight of baseless suspicion and racial bias. Time lost meaning as Nadine sat trapped between frustration and determination. Despite the isolation, her resolve remained unbroken. She knew the truth was on her side. Somewhere beyond these walls, allies and advocates waited. Her company's legal team, her board of directors, even her closest friends, all would rally to defend her honor and her rights. But for now, she had to endure this limbo. The minutes ticked by slowly until, once again, the sound of footsteps broke the silence. Nadine Prescott's isolation in that claustrophobic waiting room felt endless, but the world beyond those walls was moving fast, shaping her fate without her consent or knowledge. Somewhere in the bank's sleek executive offices, high above the polished marble floors and glass doors, the atmosphere was thick with tension and impatience. Callum Stokes paced back and forth in a glass-walled conference room, his hands clenched into tight fists as he awaited the appearance of Jasper Doyle, the regional director. When Doyle's face finally appeared on the large monitor, his expression was one of cold calculation and barely concealed contempt. "Callum," Jasper began sharply, "this situation with Prescott, it's spinning out of control fast. We don't care who she claims to be. I want her out of that building before this becomes a public relations nightmare." Callum nodded eagerly, glad to have the backing of his superior. "She's a problem," he spat, "trying to waltz in here with a letter and pull $2.7 billion like she owns the place. It's absurd." Jasper's lips twisted into a sneer. "Exactly. We're not in the business of handing over billions to some girl off the street playing dress-up. Get security to escort her out. No exceptions." Callum smirked, his relief palpable. "Already on it. She's locked in that little room, completely cut off. Nobody's talking to her except us." Meanwhile, in the bank's main lobby, the ripple effects of the situation were already spreading. A junior teller named Lisa, relatively new and uncertain, stood near the counter where Morella and Callum had been discussing the ordeal earlier. Lisa caught Callum's voice low but clear enough to hear. She's probably some affirmative action hire pretending to be a boss lady. Bet she's got no real clue what she's doing. Lisa's eyes widened in discomfort, and she glanced nervously toward the waiting room where Nadine was confined. What shocked her most was that she heard the same words echoed faintly through the thin walls of the waiting room. Nadine had been sitting there, forced to endure every degrading utterance. Nadine's heart pounded as the realization of how deeply the prejudice washed over her. This wasn't just a misunderstanding or an isolated mistake. It was a systemic attack, fueled by assumptions about her race, her gender, and her place in the world. Back in the conference room, Jasper Doyle was finishing his call, already drafting a plan to contain the damage. No statement, no acknowledgement. Just make sure she's removed quietly and the account stays frozen. We'll deal with the fallout later. Callum's phone buzzed and he glanced at the message. Corporates holding firm. They won't reverse the freeze without more proof, and with the public perception turning sour, it's better to keep this under wraps for now. The executives weren't interested in justice or fairness. They were focused on damage control, on protecting the bank's reputation and their own positions. Nadine's name was little more than a liability to them. Meanwhile, in the waiting room, Nadine fought to keep her composure. Every whisper, every insult, every doubting look that came through the walls chipped away at her resolve. Yet beneath the storm of doubt and discrimination, a quiet strength was growing. She replayed the conversations, the laughter, the dismissals in her mind and refused to let them define her. She reached deep into her reservoir of endurance, remembering the countless battles she had fought against prejudice, against dismissiveness, against the odds. This was just another fight. But this time, the stakes were higher. She thought of the thousands of employees whose jobs depended on this transfer. She thought of the promises she had made to herself and her company. And she refused to be broken. The isolation was suffocating. But Nadine's mind was already working, planning, reaching out beyond the walls that contained her. Nadine Prescott's time in the cold waiting room came to a harsh and humiliating end when the heavy door swung open abruptly, revealing two security guards flanking her like reluctant jailers. They motioned for her to stand, their stoic faces betraying no sympathy for the ordeal she had just endured. Nadine rose carefully, feeling the stiffness in her legs after sitting motionless for what seemed like hours. The guards guided her down the narrow hallway and back into the glaring, unforgiving light of the bank's main lobby, where the eyes of every customer and employee instantly locked onto her. The atmosphere shifted palpably. Whispers ceased for a moment as people stared openly, sensing the gravity of the situation. Callum Stokes stood prominently near the teller counters, his posture rigid and triumphant. As Nadine was brought forward, he raised his voice to carry across the room, ensuring every ear caught his judgment. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, voice dripping with condescension, "we are refusing this fraudulent transaction attempt. This woman has failed to provide legitimate authorization for a multi-billion-dollar transfer and will not be allowed to conduct any business here." His words were a verdict rendered without trial, condemning Nadine before she could even speak. Her briefcase and papers, hastily carried in the scramble, were suddenly knocked from her grasp. Documents scattered across the polished floor, fluttering like fallen leaves as she bent to gather them with trembling hands. A few customers in the crowd snickered, others shook their heads in disbelief or disgust, and some simply stared, frozen in judgment. Mirella Kane stepped forward, eyes gleaming with cruel satisfaction. She reached down and grabbed Nadine's authorization letter, waving it with theatrical disdain. "Maybe next time," Mirella said loudly, voice carrying so that all could hear. "Try a payday loan. This billion-dollar fantasy isn't going to work here." The laughter that followed was cruel and loud, rippling through the crowd like a wave of scorn. Nadine's cheeks burned with shame, but her eyes remained steady, unwavering despite the torrent of humiliation. She locked gaze with Mirella for a moment, silently rejecting the falsehoods and malice. A few patrons nearby exchanged uneasy glances. Some lowered their heads, uncomfortable with the display, while others smirked, feeding off the spectacle. Nadine's breathing was shallow but deliberate as she crouched down to retrieve her scattered documents. The physical act of picking up the pieces felt symbolic, a defiant refusal to be broken. As she straightened, the security guards gave her a firm but silent signal to move. Nadine took a steadying breath and walked forward, her steps slow but deliberate, each one a quiet act of resistance. The lobby seemed to shrink around her as she passed rows of seats filled with curious onlookers. A child clutched her mother's hand tightly, wide-eyed but silent. An elderly man shook his head with a mix of sympathy and resignation. Nadine's thoughts swirled. She considered every insult, every snide remark, every lingering stare that had been cast her way. The weight of systemic bias pressed down hard, but beneath it all, a fierce determination burned bright. She would not be defined by this moment. As she reached the bank's front doors, Mirella's voice rang out one last time, loud enough to cut through the noise and echo behind her. Nadine Prescott stood on the cold pavement outside Southern Heights Bank, the city's afternoon hustle washing around her like a distant storm she had somehow escaped but could never quite outrun. Her heart pounded with a mixture of humiliation, anger, and unyielding determination. The viral videos, the whispered slurs, the public shaming, they had all tried to dismantle her identity, to erase the woman who had built an empire from nothing but vision, grit, and relentless perseverance. But Nadine Prescott was not a woman who could be broken by words or walls, and now the moment had come to reclaim her story, her dignity, and her rightful place. Her phone buzzed insistently in her purse, a lifeline to the world she had been forcibly severed from. With shaking hands, she pulled it out, eyes scanning the screen filled with urgent messages and calls from her legal team, corporate board members, and trusted allies. Nadine took a deep breath, steadying herself, and made a decision. She was going back inside. She wasn't just going to clear her name. She was going to confront every lie, every assumption, and every injustice head-on. The lobby doors of the bank slid open, and Nadine stepped inside with a composed, unwavering grace that belied the storm beneath her calm exterior. The murmurs and stares resumed immediately as customers and staff caught sight of her return. Mirella Kane, standing near the front counter, froze mid-conversation, a flicker of recognition and dread crossing her face. Callum Stokes, who had been coordinating with security, turned sharply to see Nadine enter again. The smug expression that had colored his face just moments before evaporated, replaced by something closer to unease. Nadine didn't speak at first. She moved with purpose through the room, her head held high, eyes scanning for the faces of those who had sought to diminish her. A small group of employees watched in stunned silence, the gravity of the moment settling heavily on everyone present. Nadine approached the counter where Morella stood, the very person who had mocked and dismissed her. From her purse, Nadine withdrew a thick leather portfolio and set it on the counter with deliberate care. "I believe there are some documents you haven't seen yet," she said, voice calm but resolute. She flipped the portfolio open, revealing a collection of official papers, corporate board resolutions, notarized letters, legal filings, and the company's seal stamped prominently on the pages. She pulled out the original letter authorizing the $2.7 billion transfer, the very document Morella had dismissed as a forgery, and laid it flat on the counter. "This letter," Nadine explained, "was drafted and signed by me as the founder and majority owner of Prescott Industries. It has been approved by the board and our legal counsel, and it authorizes the immediate transfer of funds for critical operational needs." The room fell into a heavy silence as eyes shifted between Nadine and the mountain of evidence she presented. Even Morella's confident facade faltered, her smile vanishing as she glanced nervously at Callum, who in turn looked as if the ground had opened beneath him. "I'm sorry," Nadine continued, "but I am the person you should have been assisting all along, not treating like a criminal." A bank executive stepped forward, his face a mask of discomfort as he whispered urgently into his phone. Nadine's legal team was already on the line, ready to escalate the matter beyond the bank's walls if necessary. Callum opened his mouth to speak, but Nadine cut him off, her voice gaining strength. "I expect a formal apology and the immediate processing of the transfer. Anything less will force me to pursue legal action." Several customers who had been watching the drama unfold quietly nodded in support, some murmuring words of encouragement. The power dynamic had shifted dramatically. The woman who had been humiliated now commanded the room with undeniable authority. As the bank staff scrambled to verify the documents, Nadine took a moment to address the whispers and the assumptions that had fueled her mistreatment. "I am here not only as a business owner, but as a person who deserves respect regardless of the color of her skin or her gender. Prejudice has no place in your institution." The weight of her words settled heavily, piercing through the veneer of complacency and denial that had allowed such discrimination to flourish unchecked. The moment Nadine Prescott presented her credentials and unassailable proof of authority to the bank, the entire atmosphere inside Southern Heights Bank shifted like tectonic plates rearranging beneath the polished marble floors. The executives who had previously treated her with suspicion and disdain suddenly found themselves scrambling to repair the damage their own prejudice had caused. Within minutes, the phone in the corner of the lobby rang sharply, and a tall man in an impeccably tailored suit appeared at the entrance, Jonathan Blake, the global CEO of Southern Heights Bank. His arrival was like a gust of cold wind, commanding immediate attention. His sharp eyes surveyed the room and locked onto Nadine, standing resolute by the counter, her portfolio of documents still open before her. "Ms. Prescott," Blake said, his tone brisk but polite, "I have been fully briefed on your situation. Let me begin by apologizing for the treatment you have endured. This is unacceptable." Nadine held his gaze steadily, refusing to let him off with mere words. "Apologies are a start," she replied evenly, "but actions speak louder." Blake nodded in acknowledgement. "Of course. Effective immediately, I am ordering the account freeze lifted and authorizing the transfer of $2.7 billion in your company's name. This will be done under your direct supervision." The bank staff, including Callum Stokes and Morella Kane, visibly flinched at the CEO's command. The weight of their misjudgments hung heavy in the air. Nadine didn't waste a moment. She stepped forward and began overseeing the processing of the transfer herself, ensuring that every detail was correct and nothing could be obstructed again. The bank systems, once cold and unyielding barriers, now moved with urgent precision under her watchful eye. But Nadine's resolve extended beyond just salvaging this one transaction. She called Jonathan Blake aside, lowering her voice with the authority of a woman used to making decisions that affected billions. "I want the bank to know that this incident has permanently altered our relationship," she said firmly. Prescott Industries currently holds $6 billion in assets and accounts with Southern Heights. "I am closing every single one, effective immediately." The CEO's face registered shock mixed with regret. "Ms. Prescott, please reconsider. We value your business and the long-standing partnership with your company." Nadine's eyes did not waver. "This is non-negotiable. I will transfer all our accounts to another institution that respects its clients and operates without bias or prejudice. If Southern Heights wishes to regain our trust, fundamental changes must be made." The room seemed to hold its breath as the enormity of her decision sank in. Customers and staff alike whispered behind her back, some in admiration, others in disbelief. Nadine had taken the ultimate stand, a corporate severance that would send shockwaves through the financial industry. Yet this wasn't an act of spite, but a demand for accountability and respect. Blake nodded solemnly. "Understood. We will begin the process immediately." As Nadine watched the bank mobilize to execute her instructions, she felt a measure of satisfaction. The same institution that had sought to humiliate and marginalize her was now scrambling to rectify their failures in real time. But Nadine knew the battle was far from over. This was a watershed moment, a catalyst for change not only within Southern Heights Bank, but across the broader corporate landscape. She would use this moment to shine a light on systemic bias, to push for reforms that ensured no one else would endure the humiliation she had faced. Over the following hours, legal teams and financial experts moved swiftly, coordinating the transfer of Prescott Industries' entire portfolio. The magnitude of the $6 billion exit sent ripples through the market, catching the attention of competitors eager to welcome such a powerful client. News outlets, initially feeding off a scandal, began to focus on Nadine's commanding leadership and unwavering dignity. Interviews, statements, and profiles painted her not as a victim, but as a visionary force reshaping corporate America. Behind the scenes, Nadine maintained her poised professionalism, engaging with every facet of the transition to ensure her company's interests remained protected. The fallout from Nadine Prescott's relentless stand against Southern Heights Bank's discriminatory treatment erupted with the force of a storm shaking the very foundations of the institution. Mere hours after Nadine had finalized the transfer of $2.7 billion and closed out $6 billion in assets, internal investigations accelerated into a frenzy. The CEO, Jonathan Blake, faced relentless pressure from both shareholders and the public. Emails and internal communications leaked to the press, revealing a damning truth. Mirella Kane and Callum Stokes had willfully disregarded the bank's own verification protocols simply because Nadine didn't fit the profile they expected. The correspondence exposed their casual use of racial and gender-based assumptions to deny a legitimate transaction, an explicit violation of corporate policy and federal anti-discrimination laws. News outlets pounced on the scandal. Headlines screamed of racism at the highest levels and billion-dollar blunder, how prejudice cost a major bank its largest client. Social media exploded with outrage and calls for justice. Customers flooded the bank's customer service lines, many threatening to pull their own accounts in solidarity with Nadine. The bank stock price took a precipitous dive, plummeting as investor confidence evaporated overnight. Shareholders convened emergency meetings, demanding accountability and swift action to protect the bank's future. Under mounting pressure, Jonathan Blake called a press conference, standing before a sea of reporters and flashing cameras to deliver a statement that felt more like damage control than genuine remorse. "We deeply regret the events that transpired," Blake announced somberly. "Southern Heights Bank holds itself to the highest standards of integrity and equality. Effective immediately, Mirella Kane and Callum Stokes have been terminated for their failure to adhere to these principles." The announcement was met with mixed reactions. Some viewed it as a necessary step, others as too little, too late. Meanwhile, Mirella and Callum were escorted from the premises in full view of customers and staff alike. Their faces, once proud and smug, were now marked by shame and disbelief. As they passed through the lobby, whispered conversations followed them like shadows. "Did you hear they let them go?" one customer murmured. "Good riddance," another replied. The repercussions extended beyond mere job loss. Both faced investigations by regulatory bodies, possible lawsuits, and irreparable damage to their careers. Former colleagues distanced themselves, unwilling to be associated with their tarnished reputations. Internally, the bank scrambled to rebuild trust with a series of diversity initiatives and pledges to overhaul their training and oversight programs. Nadine's legal team played a crucial role, using the leaked communications and testimony to bolster civil rights cases and push for institutional reforms. Throughout this chaos, Nadine remained focused not on personal vengeance, but on systemic change. She engaged with advocacy groups, lawmakers, and industry leaders to advocate for stronger protections against discrimination in financial institutions. Her story became a rallying cry for equity and accountability in corporate America. Shareholders, shaken by the bank's mismanagement and public relations disaster, demanded a shakeup in leadership. Board members resigned or were replaced amid calls for transparency and reform. The bank's CEO, Blake, faced increasing scrutiny and calls for his own departure, held responsible for fostering a culture where prejudice could flourish unchecked. The financial markets responded sharply. Analysts downgraded the bank's outlook, citing reputational risk and the loss of one of its largest clients as critical blows. Competitor banks seized the opportunity, courting former Southern Heights customers and emphasizing their own commitments to diversity and fairness. In the midst of this, Nadine's name was everywhere, not as a victim, but as a symbol of courage and resilience. Profiles in major business publications chronicled her rise, her battle with the bank, and her efforts to turn personal injustice into a catalyst for widespread reform. Public figures and activists praised her leadership and tenacity, further amplifying her voice. Yet Nadine remained grounded, acutely aware that while one battle had been won, the war against systemic bias was far from over. Months had passed since the fall of Mirella Kane and Callum Stokes, and the echoes of their disgrace still lingered in the halls of Southern Heights Bank. Yet, while the institution itself struggled to repair its image and rebuild trust, the two former employees found themselves cast far from the grandeur and power they once wielded. Mirella Kane's transition was abrupt and humbling. No longer surrounded by marble counters and designer suits, she accepted a position at a small rural credit union several hundred miles away from a city. The credit union served a diverse and tight-knit community. Families, seniors, immigrants, and workers who trusted their financial institution not because of flash or reputation, but because of genuine care and integrity. Mirella entered this new world like a fish out of water, stripped of her authority and the arrogance that had once defined her. At first, she approached her job with the same impatience and superiority, frustrated by what she saw as the slow pace and modest scale of operations. But the people she served had stories and struggles that slowly chipped away at her hardened heart. There was Mrs. Daniels, a Black single mother, who came in every week to deposit the small checks she earned working 2 jobs. Mirella remembered the dismissive way she had once treated women like Mrs. Daniels in the city bank, assuming they were lesser, unworthy of respect or patience. One afternoon, when Mrs. Daniels came in looking worried and exhausted, Mirella found herself pausing, listening genuinely for the first time. The woman spoke about bills piling up, her children's dreams, and the fear of losing their home. Mirella felt a pang of shame and regret. The moment crystallized the weight of her past ignorance. Swallowing her pride, Mirella apologized sincerely to Mrs. Daniels, not just for the day's interaction, but for all the times she had let prejudice cloud her judgment. That simple act of humility marked the beginning of Mirella's transformation. Over time, she became known not for her sharp tongue, but for her patience, her willingness to help, and the respect she showed to every customer regardless of background. Her coworkers noticed the change. Customers spoke of her newfound kindness. Morella's redemption was neither fast nor easy, but it was genuine, a testament to the power of facing one's mistakes and choosing to grow beyond them. Meanwhile, Callum Stokes' journey was different, but no less profound. After being fired and losing the trappings of his once powerful position, Callum found himself adrift and isolated. His savings dwindled, and with few prospects, he began volunteering at a community center on the city's outskirts, a place far removed from the gleaming skyscrapers and corporate boardrooms he once commanded. At the center, Callum encountered people whose lives were worlds away from his privileged existence. Single parents struggling to make ends meet, immigrants rebuilding their futures, young adults fighting to escape cycles of poverty. He listened to their stories, often quietly at first, but gradually with empathy. The raw humanity and resilience he witnessed pierced through years of arrogance and ignorance. Callum was forced to confront the biases he had long ignored or justified. One day, after hearing a particularly moving story from a young man overcoming homelessness, Callum found himself reflecting on his past behavior, his dismissal of people based on assumptions, the cruelty he had enabled at the bank. The realization was painful but necessary. With time, Callum began speaking publicly about his journey, urging others in positions of power to examine their prejudices and commit to change. Years later, in an unexpected gesture of accountability, Callum composed an email to Nadine Prescott. He wrote candidly, acknowledging his mistakes and expressing gratitude for her courage in standing firm despite the crushing odds. "I see now," he wrote. "I was wrong. Thank you for showing me what true strength and dignity look like." Nadine's response was gracious but firm, recognizing the significance of his words as a step toward healing, but emphasizing the work that remained to be done for true equity to flourish. The bank itself underwent profound changes, prompted not just by public outcry, but by the undeniable loss of business and reputation. Diversity and inclusion initiatives were revamped, leadership restructured, and new policies implemented to prevent the kind of discrimination that had brought it to its knees. Employees at every level received training, not as a formality, but as a commitment to changing culture. Nadine Prescott's experience became a case study in business schools and corporate seminars, a powerful lesson on the cost of prejudice and the necessity of respect in the modern workplace. Her story inspired countless others to speak out against injustice and demand accountability. As for Nadine herself, she continued to lead her company with grace and determination, her battle with Southern Heights Bank a defining chapter in her journey. She used her platform to advocate for social justice, mentorship, and systemic change, reminding the world that success was not just about wealth or power, but about the courage to confront inequity and the will to transform it. The end of this saga was not merely about punishment or redemption. It was about the human capacity to learn, to change, and to rise above prejudice. Morella and Callum's journeys illustrated that even those who fall deepest into ignorance and arrogance could find a path toward understanding and humility. Nadine's victory was a beacon, not just of personal triumph, but of a future where justice comes before injustice, where respect is unconditional, and where every individual is seen for their true worth. This was the message that resonated far beyond the walls of one bank, echoing across industries and communities, reminding us all that change begins with truth, accountability, and the willingness to grow. The end. If you enjoyed the story, please like and subscribe so you don't miss more powerful tales like this. What did you think of the plot? Were you surprised by the twists and how things unfolded? Let me know where you're watching from and share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear your perspective.